The punch echoed through the parking garage like a gunshot. A closed fist, bone against bone, a man collapsing onto cold concrete. Blood spilled from a split lip as Richard Caldwell, a 52-year-old real estate executive worth tens of millions of dollars, stood over the homeless man he had just struck. "Stay away from my car," Richard shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "Get out of here before I call the police." The homeless man, thin, barely 30, clothes torn and stained by life on the streets, looked up from the ground, not with hatred, not with fear, but with a sadness so deep it felt ancient. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, picked up a small worn bag, wiped the blood from his mouth with his sleeve, and whispered just 4 words: "God bless you." Then he limped into the darkness. Richard climbed into his black luxury SUV, slammed the door, and drove away, convinced he was right, convinced he was justified, convinced that the man deserved it. What Richard did not know, what he could not possibly imagine in that moment of blind anger, was that he had just struck someone who would return, not for revenge, but for truth. A truth that would tear down everything Richard had built and rebuild his life in a way no amount of money ever could. If stories of real transformation move your heart, subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us. These stories aren't just told, they're meant to change us. It was Friday night, just after 10:40 p.m., in downtown Dallas, Texas. Richard Caldwell walked out of an upscale steakhouse still smiling from the business dinner he had just finished. The deal was done, one of the biggest of the year. And no contract signed, hands shaken, champagne poured. Another win. Richard had built his empire the American way. Long hours, ruthless focus, and the belief that success belonged to those willing to take it. At 52, he was the CEO of a construction and real estate company that dominated entire neighborhoods. People knew his name. Banks returned his calls. Doors opened when he walked in. His black SUV waited for him in the private parking garage, polished earlier that week, gleaming under fluorescent lights like a symbol of everything he'd earned. As Richard reached for his keys, he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. A man stepped out of the shadows. "Sir," the man said softly, keeping his distance, "could you help me with something to eat? I haven't eaten in 2 days." Richard's good mood evaporated instantly. He had just spent hundreds of dollars on dinner. This was a private garage. His car was spotless. And now this, someone like that approaching him. "I don't have any cash," Richard snapped. It was a lie. He had plenty. But that money was his, earned, protected, deserved. "I don't need much," the man replied gently, taking a small step closer. His hand brushed the side of the SUV. A single dirty fingerprint appeared on the glossy black paint. Something inside Richard exploded. "Don't touch my car," he shouted, shoving the man hard. The man stumbled backward, barely catching himself. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean—" "Shut up." Richard's stress, his anger, his years of pressure and competition poured out in one violent moment. He closed his fist and swung. The punch landed square on the man's face. The sound was sickening. The man collapsed onto the concrete, blood pooling at his mouth. "Get away from my car, you filthy bum!" Richard yelled. "Go, now!" For a moment, the man didn't move. Then slowly he stood. He picked up his bag, wiped the blood from his lip, and looked at Richard one last time. Not with hatred, but with sorrow, as if Richard had failed a test he never knew he was taking. "God bless you," the man whispered, and disappeared into the night. Richard drove home with trembling hands, not from guilt, but from adrenaline. He told himself he had done the right thing, but deep down, something had already begun to crack. Richard Caldwell's SUV rolled through the quiet streets of Highland Park, headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. The neighborhoods grew cleaner, brighter, more manicured with every turn, lawns trimmed perfectly, houses glowing softly behind tall gates. This was his world. He pulled into the driveway of his modern home, a place built with glass, steel, and silence. Inside, everything was expensive and empty. Lauren, his wife of 20 years, was already in bed. Her phone glowed faintly in the dark as she scrolled, barely looking up when Richard entered the room. "Dinner go well?" she asked, her voice flat, practiced. "Deals close," Richard replied. "That's good," she said, eyes never leaving the screen. There was nothing more to say. Down the hall, their 17-year-old son, Ethan, sat in his room with headphones on, locked inside a world of music and gaming. Their daughter, Mia, 15, was curled up on her bed, illuminated by the blue glow of social media, chasing validation from strangers instead of connection from family. Richard passed their doors without stopping. In his study, he poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey and sat alone in the leather chair that once symbolized success. He took a long drink and closed his eyes. That's when the image came back. The blood, the concrete, the man's eyes. Richard opened his eyes sharply and shook his head, annoyed at himself. He touched my car, he told himself. He crossed a line. People like that need boundaries. The justifications came easily. They always had. He finished his drink and poured another. That night, Richard didn't sleep well. He dreamed he was lying on cold ground, unable to move, while people walked past him. Businessmen, families, couples, none of them stopping. Someone laughed. Someone kicked dirt near his face. No one helped. He woke before dawn, heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. Saturday morning came quietly. Lauren was already up, sipping coffee and scrolling through travel plans. "We should go to church tomorrow," she said casually. "It's been a few weeks." Richard nodded without thinking. Church had become routine, part tradition, part social obligation, a place where people like them went to be seen as good. He showered, dressed, and headed to the office. Work was where he felt alive, where rules made sense, where results mattered. But even as he reviewed contracts and answered emails, something was off. Every few minutes, his mind drifted back to the parking garage, to the man's voice, to the words that made no sense. "God bless you." Richard clenched his jaw and focused harder. He didn't know it yet, but the life he had carefully built, brick by brick, was already beginning to crumble. And Sunday was coming. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in routine. Richard Caldwell stood in the sanctuary of a large church in North Dallas, surrounded by polished shoes, tailored jackets, and familiar faces from business lunches and charity galas. This was their rhythm: stand, sit, sing, nod. Faith practiced neatly, predictably. Lauren sat beside him, posture perfect. Ethan stared ahead without interest. Mia scrolled her phone until Lauren gave her a look. The worship music faded. The room grew quiet. The pastor stepped forward and opened his Bible. Today's reading comes from Matthew, chapter 25. Richard shifted slightly in his seat. The pastor's voice was calm, steady. "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in." Richard felt a faint tightening in his chest. The pastor continued, "Then the righteous will ask, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you?' And the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" Richard's heartbeat quickened. The image flashed into his mind without warning. A dim parking garage, a dirty hand on black paint, a fist swinging through air. The pastor paused, letting the words settle. "And then Jesus says to the others, 'For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me.'" Richard felt heat rise to his face. The pastor looked out over the congregation. "Church," he said gently, "Christ still comes to us today, not in power, not in comfort, but in need. And how we respond reveals who we truly serve." Richard swallowed hard. Hungry, stranger, in need. He hadn't just ignored the man. He had struck him. Cold sweat formed at the base of Richard's neck. His hands felt clammy. He glanced around, suddenly convinced everyone could see straight through him, like his thoughts were written across his suit. The rest of the service blurred. He stood when others stood, sat when others sat, sang words he didn't hear. All he could hear was the echo of a whisper from 2 nights earlier. "God bless you." When the service ended, people lingered in the aisles, laughing, making lunch plans. Richard didn't wait. "We're leaving," he said sharply, already heading toward the exit. Lauren looked surprised but followed. In the parking lot, Richard unlocked the car with shaking hands and pulled away in silence. The sermon replayed in his mind over and over, each word landing like a hammer. Whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. Richard stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. For the first time in years, success felt meaningless. And for the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell was afraid. He didn't know why. He didn't know of what. But deep down, he sensed it clearly. Something, or someone, was about to confront him. And there would be no way to buy his way out. Monday morning arrived with familiar urgency. Richard Caldwell was back in his glass-walled office by 8 a.m., suit pressed, coffee untouched, meetings stacked back to back, contracts waiting to be signed, numbers that demanded attention. This was where he felt in control, or at least he used to. He tried to focus on the spreadsheets glowing on his monitor, but the words from Sunday refused to leave him alone. Hungry, stranger, least of these. He clenched his jaw and kept working, forcing himself back into efficiency. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Melissa, stood at the door, hesitating. "Mr. Caldwell, there's someone here to see you." "I don't have time," Richard said without looking up. "Reschedule." "He says it's urgent," she replied. "He says you met him Friday night." Richard's fingers froze above the keyboard. Friday night, the parking garage. His pulse jumped. "Who is it?" he asked carefully. "He didn't give a name," Melissa said, "but he said you'd remember him." Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. His first instinct was irritation. Of course he showed up. Then came something sharper. Fear. Not of trouble, but of exposure. Is he here to demand money? To cause a scene? To threaten legal action? "Tell him I'm unavailable," Richard said. "I already tried," Melissa replied. "He said he'll wait, as long as it takes." Richard exhaled through his nose. Money could fix this. It always had. A quiet settlement, a generous check, a clean exit. "Fine," Richard said at last. "Send him in." Melissa nodded and stepped away. Richard straightened his tie and stood, bracing himself. He rehearsed the words in his mind. "I'm willing to compensate you. Let's keep this professional." He glanced at the framed awards on his wall, reminders of authority and success. The door opened. A man stepped inside. Richard's breath caught in his throat. It was the same face, the same age, the same eyes. But everything else was different. The man was clean, in his posture calm. He wore a simple white garment, unmarked by dirt, and over his shoulders rested a deep red cloth that seemed to glow softly under the office lights. There was no sign of blood, no bruises, except for a faint scar at the corner of his lip. The room felt different, warmer, still. The man looked directly at Richard, not accusing, not angry, just knowing. "Hello, Richard," he said gently. Richard's legs felt weak. His voice barely worked. Who are you?" The man took a slow step forward, and with that single step, Richard knew. This meeting was not about money, and there would be no easy way out. The man stood quietly in the center of Richard Caldwell's office, surrounded by glass, steel, and symbols of power. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth felt dry, and he tried to remind himself this was impossible. Just another coincidence. Another trick of the mind fueled by guilt and exhaustion. Yet something in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, not threatening, sacred. "I asked you a question," Richard said, forcing his voice steady. "Who are you?" The man's eyes softened. "You already know," he replied. Richard shook his head. "No, I don't. You're—" He stopped himself, swallowing hard. "You're the man from the garage." "Yes," the man said simply. Richard's pulse surged. "I'm sorry about what happened. I lost my temper. I shouldn't have—" He gestured vaguely toward the scar on the man's lip. "I can make this right. I'll pay for medical bills. I'll compensate you. Whatever you need." The man stepped closer. "Richard," he said gently, I didn't come for your money." The words landed heavier than any accusation. "I came for you." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. "You came to me?" he repeated, confused, defensive. "You followed me here?" The man nodded slowly. "I came to you on Friday night." Richard's stomach tightened. "I came hungry," the man continued. I came tired. I came with empty hands. And I asked you for help. Richard's jaw clenched. I didn't know who you were. That, the man said softly, is exactly the point. He extended his hands. Richard's breath caught in his throat. In the center of each palm were scars, deep, unmistakable marks that could not be explained away. Old wounds, healed but never erased. No, Richard whispered. This isn't possible. The man met his gaze. Sorrow and love intertwined in a way that made Richard's knees weaken. I was hungry, he said again, and you did not feed me. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Instead, you struck me. The words echoed in the room like thunder. Richard staggered backward and collapsed into his chair, his head dropping into his hands. I didn't know, he choked. If I had known, the man shook his head. If you had known, it wouldn't have mattered, he said, because love that depends on recognition is not love. You are not called to treat people with dignity only when you know they are important. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Every person you meet carries the image of God. The homeless man, the struggling employee, the forgotten stranger. When you look away from them, you look away from me. Tears spilled through Richard's fingers. I'm sorry, he whispered. Please forgive me. The man's voice grew warmer. I forgave you before you asked, he said, before you lifted your fist. Forgiveness is who I am. Richard looked up slowly, eyes red and trembling. Then why are you here? He asked. If I'm forgiven, why does this still feel like everything is falling apart? The man smiled, not gently this time, but knowingly. Because forgiveness does not mean the way you're living won't destroy you, he said. And I did not come only to forgive you, Richard. He leaned forward, meeting Richard's eyes. I came to give you a chance to change. The room fell silent. Outside the glass walls, the city moved on. Meetings scheduled, deals made, lives rushed through. But inside that office, time seemed to stop. Richard Caldwell had spent his entire life building walls to protect himself, and in a single moment, they were all coming down. Richard Caldwell sat frozen in his chair, staring at the man before him. No, at Jesus. The word formed in his mind before he dared to say it. Everything in him wanted to deny it, to rationalize, to explain this away as stress or guilt or imagination. But the truth stood in front of him, calm and unmovable. Jesus rested a hand on the edge of Richard's desk, the surface cluttered with contracts, awards, and framed headlines praising growth and success. You've built impressive things, Jesus said quietly. Cities, companies, wealth. Richard nodded weakly. I worked for it. I sacrificed. I gave everything. Yes, Jesus replied. Well, you gave everything, except yourself. The words struck deeper than anger ever could. You have a wife you no longer truly speak to, Jesus continued. Children you provide for but do not know. You attend church but only as a habit. You give charity when it benefits your image, and you call this a good life. Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but nothing came out. When was the last time you asked your daughter how she was really doing? Jesus asked. When was the last time you listened to your son without checking your phone? When was the last time you sat with your wife and spoke about fear instead of schedules? Richard's chest tightened. He searched his memory and found nothing. Tears slipped down his face uninvited. And your business, Jesus said gently, though the truth carried weight. How many people have you laid off to protect margins you did not need to protect? How many families felt the consequences of your decisions while you slept comfortably? It's business, Richard whispered, his voice thin. That's how the world works. Jesus met his gaze. There is no just business, he said. There are only people. Every decision touches a life, and every life matters. Silence filled the office. Richard felt exposed, stripped of excuses. The empire he had spent decades building suddenly looked fragile, hollow. What do you want from me? He asked at last. Jesus straightened, his expression unwavering. I want you to live as I lived, he said, for 30 days. Richard blinked. What does that mean? 30 days without your money, without your name, without your power, Jesus continued. No wallet, no phone, in no credit cards, no titles, no protection. Richard's heart pounded. You will live among the poor, Jesus said. You will know hunger, rejection, dependence. You will see the world you have ignored. I can't just disappear, Richard protested. My company, my family. Your company will survive, Jesus said calmly. And your family has already learned to live without you. You've been gone for years, Richard, just in a different way. The words hurt because they were true. And after 30 days, Richard asked, barely audible. Jesus looked at him with steady compassion. After 30 days, he said, you will decide who you want to be. Richard stared at the floor, his mind racing through everything he stood to lose. Comfort, reputation, control. Then he thought of what he had already lost. Peace, connection, his own soul. He lifted his head. And if I say no, he asked. Jesus did not threaten. He did not plead. Then you will return to your life as it is, he said, rich in possessions, poor in spirit. The room grew unbearably quiet. Richard Caldwell had closed deals worth millions without hesitation. But this was the hardest decision of his life, and it would change everything. Richard Caldwell sat in silence, staring at the floor of his office. 30 days. No money, no phone, no name. The weight of it pressed down on his chest until breathing felt difficult. He looked up at Jesus, searching for hesitation, for softness, for a way out. There was none, only patience. Richard stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, thick with cards, IDs, access passes. He placed it on the desk, the sound louder than it should have been. Then his phone. He hesitated, his thumb brushing the screen instinctively, as if muscle memory still believed control lived there. Messages, meetings, notifications waiting. He set it down. Next came his watch, polished steel, heavy with status. Then his car keys, his office badge. One by one, the objects that had defined him for decades formed a small pile of power he was choosing to abandon. I need to tell my family, Richard said quietly. They will be told you are safe, Jesus replied, but not where you are. Trust is part of this. Richard nodded, swallowing hard. He glanced around the office. Custom furniture, framed achievements, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city he once believed he owned. For the first time, it felt unfamiliar. I'm ready, he said. Jesus gave a single nod. They walked out together. At the reception desk, Melissa looked up, confused. Mr. Caldwell, are you heading to the board meeting? Richard stopped. No, he said, surprising even himself with the steadiness of his voice. Cancel my meetings. Tell them I'm dealing with a personal matter. How long will you be gone? She asked. Richard paused. 30 days. Melissa stared at him. Sir, should I delegate? Do what you can, Richard said. I trust the team. The words felt foreign. He had never trusted anyone with what he built. The elevator doors closed. As they descended, Richard felt something loosen inside him, fear mixed with relief. Outside, the Texas heat hit him like a wall. Cars rushed by. People hurried past without noticing him. Jesus stepped onto the sidewalk beside him. Where are we going? Richard asked. Out to the places you've driven past your whole life, Jesus replied, but never entered. They began to walk. Block by block, the city changed. Office towers gave way to worn storefronts. Clean sidewalks cracked. The air smelled different, heavier, rawer. Richard's expensive shoes felt ridiculous against the pavement. People passed them without a glance. No one recognized him. No one cared. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Caldwell was invisible. He glanced at Jesus, who walked calmly at his side, visible only to him. A strange realization settled in. The fall he had feared had already begun. And yet, beneath the fear, something unexpected stirred. Freedom. By the end of the first hour, Richard understood one thing clearly. Hunger was louder than pride. The Texas sun burned overhead as he and Jesus walked through streets Richard had only ever seen through a windshield. His throat felt dry. His stomach tightened, then growled. Sharp, insistent, humiliating. Where do people eat? Richard asked quietly. Jesus stopped near a gas station. "They ask," he said. Richard stared at the entrance. Automatic doors opened and closed as customers walked in, paid and left, without looking at him. "Ask." He stepped forward, heart pounding. "Excuse me," he said to a man exiting with a soda. "Could you spare $1? I haven't eaten today." The man didn't slow down. Richard tried again with a woman. She shook her head without meeting his eyes. A third person laughed softly and said, "Get a job." Each rejection landed heavier than the last. By noon, Richard had learned the unspoken rules. Don't stand too close, don't block the path, don't sound desperate, and most of all, don't expect kindness. He hadn't eaten since the night before. The hunger changed him. Thoughts blurred. Time slowed. His world shrank to a single question: where is my next bite? "This is what it feels like," Jesus said quietly, watching him struggle, "when survival becomes your full-time job." Late afternoon, a man finally dropped a few coins into Richard's open palm. Without stopping, without speaking, the coins felt heavy, not because of their weight, because of what it took to receive them. They bought a cheap sandwich. Richard ate it sitting on the curb, hands shaking as if his body didn't trust the food would stay. He finished too fast, immediately regretted it. Night came quickly. Without money, there was nowhere to go. They found shelter beneath an overpass where others had already claimed spots. Cardboard, old blankets, backpacks serving as pillows. No one asked questions. No one offered greetings. Richard lay on the concrete, suit jacket folded beneath his head. The ground was unforgiving, pressing into his back, stealing warmth from his body. Cars roared overhead. A siren wailed in the distance. Sleep refused to come. Every sound felt like a threat. Richard hugged his knees to his chest, shivering despite the heat of the day still trapped in the concrete. "I've never slept like this," he whispered. Jesus sat nearby, watching over him. "Many never sleep any other way," he replied. Richard closed his eyes. Images flooded his mind. Hotel beds, clean sheets, air conditioning set just right. He thought of his home, his bed, his locked doors. Tears slipped into his ears, soaking into the concrete. This wasn't an experience. This wasn't an exercise. This was life, for millions. As dawn approached, Richard realized something terrifying. He had survived his first day, and it had nearly broken him. If one day without money could do this, what would 30 days do? He opened his eyes and stared at the gray sky above the bridge. For the first time, the question wasn't, "How do I get out of this?" It was, "Who am I becoming in it?" By the second week, Richard learned a harder truth than hunger. Hunger hurt, cold exhausted, but invisibility broke something deeper. He stood near a busy intersection as commuters rushed past, briefcases swinging, phones glowing, conversations half finished. Hundreds of people passed within arm's reach. Almost none looked at him. That Richard tried to make eye contact. He softened his voice. He stood back, then closer, then farther away. It didn't matter. Most people walked around him as if he were a crack in the sidewalk, something to step over, not acknowledge. Some glanced at him and immediately looked away. A few smirked. One man filmed him with his phone, whispering something to a friend before laughing. Another shouted, "Move along!" as if Richard were blocking traffic instead of standing still. By midday, Richard felt himself shrinking, not physically, internally. He understood now why so many people on the streets kept their heads down. Hope, when it's raised too often and crushed too easily, becomes dangerous. "Why won't they even look at me?" Richard asked quietly. Jesus walked beside him, hands folded. "So, because seeing you would require them to see themselves," he replied. "And most people are not ready for that." Late afternoon brought heat and exhaustion. Richard's stomach tightened again, sharper than before. He had no coins left, no plan. Then he smelled food. A small food truck was parked near the curb. Paint faded, a handwritten menu taped to the side. A woman in her 40s moved quickly inside, flipping tortillas, wiping sweat from her forehead. Richard hesitated. Asking again felt unbearable. Jesus nodded toward the truck. Richard approached slowly. "Ma'am," he said, barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry to bother you. I haven't eaten today. Is there any chance?" The woman looked up and met his eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't scan him with suspicion. She smiled. "Sit," she said, already turning back to the grill. Richard froze. I, I don't have money." She waved her hand. "I didn't ask." Minutes later, she handed him a plate piled higher than he expected. "Eat," she said simply. "No one should go hungry." Richard's hands trembled as he took it. He sat on the curb and ate slowly, afraid the moment would disappear if he rushed it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Richard," he said after a pause. "I'm Maria," she replied. "You be okay tonight?" He nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. Maria pressed a bottle of water into his hand. "Take this too." As Richard stood to leave, he felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Shame. Not because he was poor, but because he remembered all the times he had driven past people like Maria without seeing them, without wondering, without caring. "She gave you more than food," Jesus said quietly as they walked away. Richard nodded. "She gave me dignity." Night fell again. Richard lay beneath the same overpass, stomach full but mind restless. Around him others settled into silence, wrapping themselves in whatever warmth they could find. For the first time, Richard noticed something else. Laughter. Soft, tired laughter between people who had nothing, except each other. He stared into the darkness, understanding something he had never learned in boardrooms or church pews. Poverty did not erase humanity. Indifference did. And for the first time, Richard wasn't just surviving the streets, he was beginning to see them. By the third week, Richard stopped counting days. Time no longer moved in neat blocks, measured by meetings and deadlines. It stretched and bent, shaped by hunger, heat, and the small mercies that kept him going. What changed most wasn't his body, it was his vision. He no longer saw the homeless. He saw people. There was Henry, 77 years old, who slept on a piece of cardboard folded with military precision. Henry had once been a high school history teacher, and before that, a soldier. He spoke quietly, choosing his words carefully, as if every sentence mattered. "I had a pension," Henry told Richard one evening. "Not much, but enough. Then my wife got sick. Cancer, insurance ran out. Bills didn't." He shrugged, a small motion carrying decades of loss. "When she died, I sold the house to pay what I could. After that, there wasn't much left." Henry smiled faintly. "Funny thing is, I taught my students about dignity. Never thought I'd have to fight for my own." Then there was Keisha, 19, pregnant, living between shelters. She kept one hand on her stomach, as if protecting the life inside her from the world. "I'm scared," she admitted one afternoon, sitting on a curb beside Richard. "But I still believe this baby's going to have a better life than I did." She talked about names, about wanting to finish school, about becoming a nurse. Hope, fragile but stubborn, lived in her voice. Richard listened, really listened. Each story chipped away at the walls he had built inside himself. These weren't cautionary tales. They weren't statistics. They were human lives shaped by circumstances, choices, losses, and bad luck. One night, Richard woke shaking with fever. His head throbbed. His throat burned. Every joint ached. Without money, without insurance, there was nowhere to go. He lay there, barely aware of time passing, until a shadow fell across him. Shukisha knelt beside him with a blanket. "You're burning up," she said. She handed him a cup of soup, thin but warm, and a few pills wrapped in tissue. "It's all I have," she said, "but it helped me last month." Richard tried to protest. She shook her head. "Out here, we take care of each other. That's how we survive." As she tucked the blanket around his shoulders, something broke inside Richard. He had paid thousands a year for private health care. Yet here he was, being cared for by a young woman with nothing except compassion. "You okay?" Jesus asked quietly, sitting nearby. Richard nodded weakly. Tears slid down the sides of his face, soaking into the concrete. "I built my life on the wrong things," he whispered. Jesus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured around them, to Henry settling in for the night, to Keisha humming softly to her unborn child, to others sharing what little they had. "Look again," he said, "and tell me what you see." Richard lifted his head. He saw suffering, but he also saw courage. He saw generosity that cost more than money. He saw dignity that had nothing to do with titles. "I see people," Richard said at last. "People who matter." Jesus nodded. By the end of the third week, Richard understood something he had never learned in a lifetime of success. The streets were not filled with failures, they were filled with stories. And once you learned their names, you could never unsee them. By the fourth week, something inside Richard had shifted. The hunger was still there. The exhaustion hadn't disappeared. The nights on cold concrete were no easier, but the panic was gone. Richard no longer woke each morning asking how to escape. He woke asking who he could help. Without realizing it, he had begun to move differently. He stood straighter. He spoke more gently. He listened, really listened, when someone talked, even if their story wandered or repeated itself. One morning, Richard helped an older man gather scattered belongings after a security guard forced them to move. Another day, he spent hours sweeping trash around a shelter, not because anyone asked him to, but because it needed to be done. No one thanked him, and strangely, that felt right. "Why does this feel different?" Richard asked Jesus as they walked through a quiet park just after sunrise. "Because you're no longer trying to prove anything," Jesus replied. You're simply present." Richard thought about his former life, how every action had been measured, tracked, optimized. Even generosity had been calculated. Donations timed, photos taken, credit insured. Out here, none of that mattered. People didn't know his name. They didn't care who he used to be. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. One afternoon, Richard shared his sandwich with a man who hadn't eaten in 2 days. As he handed it over, a flicker of hesitation rose in him, the old instinct to protect his own supply. He pushed it away. Later that night, lying beneath the overpass, Richard realized something quietly miraculous. He was at peace. "How is that possible?" he asked, staring up at the concrete ceiling above him. Jesus sat beside him. "Because peace does not come from control," he said. "It comes from alignment." Richard nodded slowly. He began to pray, not with polished words or memorized phrases, but honestly. Sometimes only a sentence, sometimes only silence. He prayed for Henry, for Keisha and her baby, for Maria at the food truck, for his children. And then, unexpectedly, he prayed for himself, not for success, not for comfort, but for courage to remain changed. On the morning of the 30th day, Richard woke before dawn. The city was still, the sky just beginning to lighten. Jesus stood nearby, hands folded, watching him. "Have you learned what you needed to learn?" Jesus asked. Richard sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. "Yes," he said. "What did you learn?" Jesus pressed gently. Richard searched for the right words. "Anyway, I learned that I spent my life chasing the wrong thing," he said at last. "That money can insulate you from reality. That power can make you blind. And that people I once dismissed carry more humanity than I ever allowed myself to see." Jesus nodded. "And what will you do with what you've learned?" Richard inhaled deeply. "I don't know every step," he admitted. "But I know I can't go back to who I was. That man would kill what's finally alive in me." A faint smile crossed Jesus' face. "Then you are ready," he said. "Ready for what?" Richard asked. "To return," Jesus replied. "Not as the man who left, but as the man you've become." Richard looked out at the waking city, at the streets that had undone him and rebuilt him all at once. For the first time, he didn't fear going back, because he knew now the real transformation had already happened. Richard stood at the edge of his own driveway, unsure how to take the final step. The house looked the same. Clean lines, quiet lights, everything in its place. It felt strange to realize that for 30 days he had slept under bridges and beside strangers. And yet this place now felt unfamiliar. He lifted his hand and knocked. The door opened slowly. A housekeeper gasped, eyes widening as she stared at the man before her. Thin, unshaven, clothes worn by weeks on the street. "Mr. Caldwell?" she whispered, unsure. Before Richard could answer, footsteps hurried down the hallway. Lauren appeared. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. Then her hand flew to her mouth. "Richard?" Her voice cracked. "Where have you been?" He tried to speak, but no explanation came easily. Words felt small compared to what had happened. I'm here, he said softly. I'm home. Lauren's composure shattered. She crossed the space between them and pulled him into her arms, sobbing. Real sobs. Not polite tears, the kind that come from fear held too long. I thought I lost you, she cried. I almost did, Richard replied, but not the way you think. Their children stood frozen at the end of the hallway. Ethan stared, unsure. Mia stepped forward slowly. Dad? She asked, her voice small. Richard turned to her and opened his arms. She hesitated only a second before stepping into them. He held her, really held her, for the first time in years. Not distracted, not rushed, just present. I'm here now, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere. Something shifted in her shoulders as she leaned into him, were as if a weight she'd carried alone finally had somewhere to rest. That night Richard showered for a long time. The hot water stung his skin, washing away weeks of dust and exhaustion. When he looked in the mirror afterward, he barely recognized the man staring back. Not because of how he looked, but because of how he felt. Later they sat together in the living room. No phones, no television, no distractions. I can't explain everything yet, Richard said carefully, but I need you to know this. I'm not the same man who walked out that door. Lauren studied him, searching for signs of a promise that would fade by morning. Something happened to you, she said quietly. Yes, Richard replied, and it changed everything. Upstairs, as the house settled into silence, Richard lay in bed beside Lauren, awake, listening to her breathe. For the first time in decades, he felt something he had chased in every deal and achievement. Rest. Outside, unseen by anyone else, Jesus stood at the edge of the yard. Richard looked toward him through the window and nodded in gratitude. Jesus returned the gesture. Then quietly, he was gone. But Richard knew. He hadn't left. Monday morning came, and for the first time in 15 years, Richard Caldwell did not go to the office. He sat at the kitchen table instead, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the light move across the floor as Lauren prepared breakfast. Ethan wandered in, surprised to see his father still home. Mia lingered in the doorway, uncertain. Don't you have meetings? Ethan asked. Richard shook his head. Not today. Mia raised an eyebrow. Since when? Richard met her gaze. Since I realized I've missed too many mornings like this. They ate together, awkwardly at first. Conversation stumbled. Silence crept in. But Richard didn't reach for his phone. That afternoon he drove Mia to a cafe near her school. Just the two of them. No agenda, no lecture. She talked about classes, about friends, about pressure to look a certain way, to be perfect online, about the quiet fear of not being enough. You don't have to earn your worth, Richard said softly, tears threatening. You already have it. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if deciding whether to believe him. Later that week, he took Ethan out for dinner, asked questions he'd never asked before, not about grades or college rankings, but about what he cared about. I think I want to help people, Ethan admitted. I don't know how yet. Richard smiled. Then we'll figure it out together. At home, Richard and Lauren began to talk, really talk, about resentment, loneliness, the years they had lived side by side but apart. I almost left, Lauren confessed one night. More than once. Richard didn't defend himself. He listened. I don't want to lose you, he said quietly, and I don't want to pretend anymore. Healing didn't happen overnight, but it began. At the office, the shift was just as dramatic. When Richard finally returned, he called a company-wide meeting. Hundreds of employees filled the room, confused and uneasy. I owe you an apology, Richard began. The room went still. I built this company chasing numbers, he continued, and I forgot that numbers are carried by people. That ends now. He announced changes, real ones. Wage increases starting with the lowest paid employees, the flexible schedules, a fund for emergencies. No more layoffs disguised as efficiency when profits could absorb the cost. Some executives protested privately. This will hurt margins, one warned. Then margins will heal, Richard replied. People come first. A few resigned, most stayed, and something unexpected happened. Productivity rose. Loyalty deepened. The culture shifted from fear to trust, but Richard knew this wasn't enough. There was still one wound left untreated, the man he had struck. Richard began searching shelters, soup kitchens, outreach centers. He asked questions. He waited. He listened. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, someone pointed him toward a transitional housing program across town. "There's a guy there," they said. "Name's Michael. Sounds like who you're looking for." Richard's heart pounded. This wasn't a symbolic act anymore. This was accountability. And he knew. The real test of his transformation was just beginning. Richard parked across the street and sat there longer than necessary. The building in front of him wasn't impressive. Plain brick, narrow windows, a sign that read, "Transitional Housing Program." It wasn't a place people like Richard Caldwell ever noticed before. But today, his hands were shaking. Inside, a caseworker led him down a quiet hallway and stopped at a door. "He's in there," she said. "Name's Michael." Richard nodded, throat tight. The door opened. The man sitting at the small table looked up and froze. Recognition hit instantly. Michael's shoulders tensed. His eyes widened. His body leaned back instinctively as if bracing for another blow. "Hey," Richard said quickly, raising his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." Michael stood up, backing away. "What do you want?" he asked, voice sharp with fear. "You come to finish the job?" The words cut deep. "No," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I came to ask if you'll let me sit." Michael hesitated, then nodded cautiously. They sat across from each other in silence. "I've thought about that night every day," Richard began. "What I did to you was wrong. There's no excuse. I'm not asking you to forgive me." Michael scoffed. "Then why are you here?" "Because forgiveness without repair is empty," Richard said. "And I owe you repair." Michael studied him, suspicious. "So what?" "You're gonna write a check and feel better about yourself." Richard shook his head. "No, I'm here to listen. And if you allow it, to help, on your terms." Michael laughed bitterly. "Help? So you don't even know me?" "You're right," Richard said. "So tell me." Something shifted. Slowly, Michael began to speak. He had been a systems analyst, a good one. Then layoffs came. His savings vanished faster than he expected. Depression followed. Friends drifted. Family stopped answering calls. "I didn't become homeless overnight," Michael said quietly. "I disappeared a little at a time." Richard listened without interrupting. Hours passed. When Michael finished, Richard took a breath. "I can't undo what I did," he said, "but I can stand with you now. If you want counseling, I'll cover it. If you want training, housing, time, I'll support that. Not because I feel guilty, because you matter." Michael stared at him. "Why?" he asked finally. Richard's answer came without hesitation. "Because someone showed me who I really was," he said. "And I don't want to be that man anymore." Tears filled Michael's eyes, surprising him. "Everyone else walked past me," he whispered. "You were the worst one." "I know," Richard said softly. "That's why I'm here." Over the next months, Richard kept his word. Michael received treatment, stable housing, a chance to rebuild skills, a job, earned, not handed. They spoke often, not as benefactor and recipient, but as two men changed by the same truth. One afternoon, months later, Michael stood in a clean apartment, keys in his hand. "You didn't save me," he said to Richard. "You gave me space to save myself." Richard shook his head. "Someone saved both of us." As Richard walked back to his car, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. This moment was worth more than any deal he had ever closed. Because redemption wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a name, and it was standing on its own feet. 2 years passed. Richard Caldwell's life no longer looked the way it once had, and that was exactly the point. He still worked. He still had resources, but the center of his life had shifted. He sold off projects that existed only to inflate profit and redirected time and money into something quieter, slower, and far more demanding. Presence. A foundation grew, not overnight and not with headlines, but steadily. Transitional housing, job training, mental health counseling, meals served without questions asked, dignity offered without conditions. Michael became one of the coordinators, using his own story to guide others out of the same darkness he once lived in. At home, the change was even more profound. Dinner became sacred again. Sci phones stayed off the table. Conversations lingered. Laughter returned in small, unexpected moments. Lauren no longer felt alone in her own house. Ethan began volunteering, discovering that success felt different when it helped someone else stand back up. Mia watched her father closely, waiting for the old patterns to return. They didn't. One winter evening, Richard stood in a community kitchen, serving meals alongside his family. He wiped down tables, listened to stories, learned names. Across the room, a man caught his eye. White garment, a red scarf resting across his shoulders. Jesus stood quietly near the doorway, smiling, not approving, not judging, simply present. Richard met his gaze and nodded. He understood now. Jesus hadn't come to punish him, or to humiliate him, or to take away his wealth. He had come to restore his humanity. Yet Richard turned back to the people in front of him, faces worn by life, eyes still carrying hope. He no longer needed to see Jesus. He saw him everywhere, in the hungry, in the forgotten, in the ones the world stepped around instead of stopping for, and perhaps most importantly, in the person he himself had become. This story isn't just about Richard. It's about a question every one of us must answer. When someone in need crosses your path, do you look away? Do you justify? Do you protect what's yours? Or do you stop long enough to see who is really standing in front of you? Because as Jesus said, whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me. If this story stirred something in you, don't ignore it. Let it change how you see the world. And if you want to hear more stories where grace still walks among us, stories of broken lives restored and hearts transformed, subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us. You never know. The next person you meet might be Jesus in disguise.